Good evening. A special program tonight. It's the last of a three-part debate series I moderated called First Principles. The series was co-sponsored by the Ayn Rand Institute, Demos, and WNYC's politics website, itsafreecountry.org. The first two debates, which we've aired previously this season, looked at the proper role of government and what freedom means in our society. The last debate, which took place on May 2nd at NYU's Skirball Center, took on the question, capitalism, is it moral? In the midst of a fierce debate over the budget, funding health care, and looking back at the financial crisis, this debate seemed very on point. We've edited the live event down to 1 hour. Please welcome our debaters. They are Wake Forest University Graduate School of Business professor and retired banker John Allison. He was the CEO of BB&T, that's Bankers Branch and Trust, and he wrote the introduction to a book called Why Businessmen Need Philosophy, The Capitalist's Guide to the Ideas Behind author Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. And Washington Post columnist and MSNBC contributor Ezra Klein. He also was a staffer at the American Prospect magazine, a publishing partner of Demos. And it's always great for me to see a politically diverse room in our polarized world, so we hope you all talk with each other seriously after the debate tonight. We want to remind everybody here, let's see, there are two conflicting messages that I'm supposed to give audiences these days. One is, please turn off your cell phones. The other is, please tweet about this event while it's going on. I'm not sure which one applies and overrides tonight, but we do have the hashtag for the event, which is FP Debate. And so those of you watching us on our live stream, hello, on whatever device you're watching us, and feel free to get a simultaneous conversation going on Twitter. Use the hashtag FP Debate. We've had an invitation on itsafreecountry.org for you to post pros and cons of capitalism leading up to this event, up to 2 pros and 2 cons per customer. Here's a small sampling of what we've gotten. Some just used it as an excuse to argue their side, like capitalism pro, drug lords love it and make lots of cash. Capitalism con, helping hurdle humanity towards self-inflicted extinction. Or capitalism pro gives hope and motivation to everyone in every class level that they can make it. And capitalism con subsidizes an anti-capitalist lefty leisure class in our universities and elitist media. But then there were those that listed both pros and cons. Capitalism first pro raises overall standard of living. Capitalism first con enriches some on the backs of others. Capitalism second pro gives people employment. Capitalism second con creates tremendous waste. Serious-minded response. Someone else, capitalism first pro encourages healthy competition, which promotes efficiency and innovation. First con, our current system requires unlimited growth, which is impossibly unsustainable. Second pro, profits can be used for outrageously beautiful things. Second con requires winners and losers, which if it gets out of hand, is intolerably unfair for the losers. And finally, capitalism first pro promotes democracy. Capitalism first con suppresses democracy. Capitalism second pro promotes peace. And capitalism second con promotes war. So the format for tonight, for those of you who were not here, who did I ask? I didn't ask. Who has been here for either of the previous 2 debates? You must have done something right. I'm glad to see it. The format, again, will be 10-minute opening statements from each, and then, or up to 10 minutes, and then a free-form moderated discussion for a while, and then we will take lots of questions from the audience. We ask, of course, that you keep it brief, keep it respectful, keep it at a high level, and we'll have people going around with some microphones, and hopefully we'll wind up balancing, which side the questions are coming from. I guess it's going to be guesswork, looking at your face. Can you tell an objectivist by looking at one? I don't know. But through mutual consent, our debaters have decided that Ezra will go first and John will go second. So Ezra Klein, thanks so much, and you have 10 minutes.
All right. Brian, thank you. John, thank you for coming, and all of you, thank you for coming out. To the Randians, I did not know there were so many of you. And to Demos, there was a time when the left could organize, guys. What happened here? I will try to take a little bit less than my 10 minutes because I'm at least partially capitalist, and that means I'm efficient. And what it does not mean, though, is that I have to particularly abide by the rules of the debate. I think this is a bad question. I have brought this up to Brian and others in other forums here, and I'm still allowed to be here. So I think asking if capitalism is moral is like asking me if a wrench is sad or the scientific method is orange. Capitalism is not a person, not a society, doesn't have moral agency. It is a tool. Like the scientific method is a tool, like regulation is a tool. The scientific method can be used to find a very efficient way to make children into milkshakes, but it can also be used to cure disease. When done one way, the people behind it are moral. When done the other, they're not moral. I'm not going to tell you actually which is which. I'm going to leave that as an exercise to the audience. My friend here and I have done this a little bit on Brian's show, and so I think one of the arguments we're going to get into here tonight is we don't actually have capitalism. So it would be moral if we did, but there is no society currently operating that is truly capitalist. We are all some form of a mixed economy with some amount of capitalism involved and some amount of government regulation, government intervention in the economy. Some sort of, I think as my friend would describe it, coercion. I 100% agree. So I thank you all for coming. And but because I agree, I am enough of a capitalist to think that that is a problem, not for the morality of capitalism, but for those who would like to see a purely capitalist society. We have 195 countries or so, things change fairly frequently. We have 195 countries or so in the world. That is a pretty good market for organizing economic and political systems. The fact that none of them appear to fit the criteria of purely capitalist, and the fact that all of these successful ones appear to fit the criteria of some form of mixed economy. And at this point, we can say China is growing very quickly, but when they start having a per capita income, let's just say for like Brazil, we can say they've been truly successful as an economy. All these successful economies have some form of a mixed economy. And I think that is correct because one of the things I think the framing of this debate gets wrong, and sometimes these discussions get wrong, and I've had a lot of them because I went to college at Santa Cruz. And when I was in those conversations, I was standing where John is standing. And I was trying to explain that, no, capitalism is fine, and Marxism isn't, in fact, the only way society can normally advance in the great sweep of human history. The arc of history is long and doesn't necessarily bend towards Marxism. And I think that it is important to consider pragmatism here as a principle. Not moral or immoral, because again, I think this is a slightly different way of going about it, but as a principle. So, in America, one of the normal discussions, one of the few, I think, policy areas where we continually have a debate about socialism or capitalism is healthcare. Those of you who read my work know that it was inevitable I was going to bring this to healthcare sooner or later, so I'm happy to try to do it as quickly as possible. We spend, as a country, 7.4% of our GDP, 7.4, on public sector healthcare. That means money that is routed through the federal government. We spend 8.4% on private sector healthcare. Now, let's just focus on 7.4% for a minute. We have a very mixed system, which I don't think anybody from either side particularly likes, but it is undoubtedly less public than other systems, right? I'm going to read you a list of a couple countries here. Japan, Australia, Norway, the United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, Canada, and Switzerland. What they have in common is not their economies. It isn't, God knows that given that the UK and Italy are both on there, it's not their food. And it isn't even their healthcare systems. The UK has a socialized system. The government employs the nurses and the doctors. Canada has a single-payer one. Switzerland is near to us than anyone else in the world. They have a multi-payer system. But here's what they all have in common. They spend a smaller percentage of their GDP on public sector healthcare. On public sector healthcare, even though in every country, the public sector is pretty much the only folks doing any healthcare. So across the world, in our sort of major mixed economy competitors, people who I think took a somewhat more pragmatic view of this at some point in the past came out with a government healthcare sector that is smaller than our own. Because sometimes when you get overly principle-focused, I think, you end up with something that is neither principled, because I don't think anybody, again, from either side would say what we've got is a very principled healthcare system, and it also isn't pragmatic. It doesn't work. Now, I think that gets me to where I want to put this, which is that the real debate we end up having, and I think correctly so because we live in a messy world, is where is the correct place on the dial for a mixed economy to land? Should we be a little bit more like the UK, or a little bit more like Japan, or a little bit further to the laissez-faire than we currently are? And that tends to work, I think, fairly well. We have a lot of people in different countries turning the dial this way and that and responding to events, and at times over-responding or under-responding to events. And we sort of muddle through. And what I would say in virtue or in praise of muddling through is that it's the only way anybody's figured out how to do this. And at least for some of us, it's worked out pretty well. When you get overly ideological, when you get overly principle-focused, I would submit that the consequences have not been that good, even though the theories have been much purer and more moral on some level than the mishmash of complicated, unkempt, unattractive decisions we end up coming to. Now, when I would have these discussions back at Santa Cruz, I used to say that, well, they used to tell me that the problem with Marxism isn't that it doesn't work, but that nobody ever tries it. And I would always say, but what about all these people who keep trying it? And they would always say, oh, no, they weren't pure enough, or whatever it might have been. At some point, I would get bored. But what I would say is that if something keeps getting tried, or at least people think they keep trying, it keeps not working, there's probably a reason for that. I do think, I guess in some ways, well, maybe not like a capitalist. I do think that, particularly in the developed world, the arc has been bending towards a true form of justice. I think that people are freer to pursue opportunities. I think that societies that tend to be richer, and there's very, very good evidence for this, tend to be much more tolerant, end up giving women and people of other races a much larger role and much more equality. They give people the freedom to fail, which also means that they have, or the protection to fail is maybe the better way to put it, and thus there is more room for the risk that powers the best parts of capitalism. And so what we have ended up with is not perfect, and maybe you wouldn't have designed it if you're doing it from scratch, but the thing about designing from scratch is that you would have ended up somewhere like here. And so going back to first principles, I think, is not necessarily the right place to end up. I think we need to go back to what we've learned from trying these first principles and say forthrightly and fairly that there's a lot that is good when capitalism is employed. Occasionally its excesses need to be tempered. And so we do. We muddle through. And with that, I've efficiently finished at 8 minutes, and I turn it over to John. Take it away.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming out tonight. I think the question of is capitalism moral presupposes the question is what is the purpose of morality? I believe the purpose of morality is to provide us with principles that improve the probability of us staying alive, being successful, and ultimately being happy. The fundamental question we're asking in morality is how can we live a high-quality life? How can we live a high-quality life? And if you think about that, then what we're really trying to do is say, given the laws of nature, Mother Nature, and given human nature, man's nature, what principles will lead to our survival, our success, and ultimately our happiness. Even having the right principles won't guarantee success and happiness because things happen in Mother Nature beyond our control, but they improve the odds. At BB&T, we have 10 core values that we've used in our business. Underlying those values are what I believe are the 3 great virtues: purpose, reason, and self-esteem. Purpose, reason, and self-esteem. I also believe that the values, the virtues that are correct for an individual are correct for an organization and they're correct for society in general. In addition, I strongly believe that the only kind of society in which people can truly practice those virtues is a society based on individual rights, a society based on economic and political freedom, a capitalist society. The three great virtues: purpose, reason, and self-esteem. As human beings, we're purpose-driven entities. We have to know where we're going in order to get there. Organizations, businesses, churches, civic organizations, universities are simply groups of human beings. For organizations to be successful, the people in those organizations must vest in the purpose of the organization. Just like organizations need purpose, so do you as an individual. In fact, one of the things I find most disturbing is I talk to people, and they'll tell me about how their work is a burden. And if you think about all the time, all the effort, all the energy you spend at work, if your work is just work, wow, are you missing a lot of what life is about. To have meaning in your life, you have to have a sense of purpose in your work. While the content of purpose will vary a lot, I believe the context is the same for everybody in this room. I believe everybody in this room wants to make the world a better place to live. I think that's a characteristic of everybody here. You wouldn't be here. In fact, I think it's a characteristic of the vast majority of human beings. I think it's common that people want to make the world a better place to live. Now, the interesting thing is you don't have to go to Africa to feed hungry children to make the world a better place to live. There are a lot of ways to make the world a better place to live. Business makes the world a better place to live. We provide products and services that improve the quality of life. In fact, the primary difference between the quality of life in the United States and the quality of life in Africa is we have better businesses. Businesses know the work. Business is the art of production, and you can't give anything away unless somebody produces it. When business leaders forget they're in business to make the world a better place to live, bad things happen to those businesses. Good doctors, good nurses, good teachers, good homemakers make the world a better place to live. There are lots of ways to make the world a better place to live. And I believe to have a sense of purpose, you have to believe that you're making the world a better place to live. The second component of purpose, however, is equally important and far under discussed. You need to make the world a better place to live doing something you want to do for you. You have a fundamental right to your own life. And if you were to make the world a better place to live and you didn't enjoy doing it, you will have wasted the most precious thing you have, which is you. And by the way, if you try to make the world a better place to live doing something you don't want to do, the odds are you won't do it very well. Only in a free society can you pursue your purpose. And you need to be making the world a better place to live, doing something you want to do for you. The means by which we accomplish our purpose is our capacity to think. We use the term reason. Everything that's alive is a method of staying alive. A lion has paws to hunt with, a deer has speed to avoid the hunter, and we have the capacity to think. And our capacity to think is literally our only means of survival, success, and happiness. So shortcuts, no free lunches. When I talk to the employees of BB&T about thinking, I talk to the fact that it's not about having a high IQ, but it is about having mental discipline, committing yourself to lifelong learning, to being an active thinker, having a very active mind. At the societal level, there's a fundamental attribute that's necessary for people to think. They have to be free to think. You cannot think under force. You cannot think with a gun pointed at your head. In addition, if you think about it, all human progress is based on creativity. There can be no progress unless somebody does something better, which will be different. Creativity is only possible to an independent thinker. Somebody that thinks like the crowd, cannot be creative, cannot be innovative, cannot contribute to human progress. That's why entrepreneurs are so important to human well-being. It's why socialism and communism is ultimately doomed to failure because it destroys innovation and creativity. You know, I'm in a university now. It's very interesting because the academics talk about academic freedom, and they're right. But the exact same people somehow think that business people can be innovative and creative when there are tons of rules and regulations that literally prevent them from thinking. In my career, I've had a number of opportunities where I could have improved the quality of life for our clients and made a profit doing it, but it was against some rules, some regulation somewhere. It's a very interesting thing happens when you're clear about your purpose, when you use your thinking capacity to accomplish your purpose, you get to do something very important. You get to raise your self-esteem. Interesting observation in a 40-year business career. When I find that people at high levels in organizations, people like in this room, when people at high levels in organizations fail, it's almost never because they aren't smart enough, or they aren't well educated enough. It is typically because they have some low self-esteem issue that results in self-destructive activity. In addition, self-esteem is the foundation for happiness, and happiness is the end of the game, right? And I don't mean happiness having a good time on Friday night, but I mean happiness in a life well lived. In the Aristotelian sense of the word, the hard work kind of happiness. You know, sometimes business people get confused. They think money's the end of the game. Nothing wrong with money. Money's a good thing. However, money is not an end. It can be a means to an end, but it is not an end. The end of the game is happiness, and the foundation for happiness is having a high level of self-esteem. Self-esteem is a complex subject, but I want to share one thought with you about self-esteem. For everybody in this room, and for the vast majority of people on this planet, the primary driver of your self-esteem is your work. You spend a disproportionate amount of time, effort, and energy at work. And I use work in a broad context. Raising children, very hard, very productive work. In fact, what makes work so important is that it does drive your self-esteem. Something I say to all the employees of BB&T, it's real important to BB&T that you do your job well, but it's far, far, far more important to you. Might fool me about how well you do your job, might fool your boss about how well you do your job, but you'll never fool you. And if you don't do your work the best you can do it, given your level of skill, given your level of knowledge, you can't do the impossible. But if you don't do your work the best you can possibly do it, you will lower your self-esteem. Interestingly enough, the reverse is also true. Do your work the best you can possibly do it, given your level of skill, given your level of knowledge, and you will raise your self-esteem. And that's more important than when you get more money or you get a promotion, because it's who you are, your fundamental character. And there's a huge social implication for that. Take a construction worker, a bricklayer, has a tough, hard life, hard work life. Reminds me of my granddad. Somehow, however, through that tough life, he raises his children. Maybe his granddaughter becomes CEO of a public traded company, maybe not. A hard life, but he gets something very precious out of that work.
And John, 2 minutes.
He gets to be proud of himself. He gets self-esteem from that work. Take that same bricklayer and give him welfare. He may be better off economically, but he loses something very precious. He loses his pride. He loses his self-esteem. And if you think about that, there's a lot of discussion in our society today about security, and we all care about security. But the United States is not the land of security. People didn't get on a boat and come to Jamestown to be secure. The United States is the land of opportunity. The opportunity to be great, the opportunity to fail and try again, but most importantly, the opportunity of that bricklayer to live life on his own terms, to pursue his personal happiness given his own fundamental beliefs. And that is the American sense of life, and that sense of life is only possible in a society based on individual rights, in a free society, in a capitalist society. And that sense of life is very, very precious. Thank you.
So, just very briefly, before we dive down on some specifics, I want to address a little bit about where the question for tonight came from, because I acknowledged Ezra's concern that you don't like the framing, and you'd rather be...
No, I really like it because it gave me an opening statement. I urge you not to change it, because then I'd have to go back and start again.
It's a little late to change it, but I will tell you, if you didn't know, and everybody, that the Wikipedia page for John's company, BB&T, calls it an American bank offering full-service commercial and retail banking, and adds that it is notable for certain ideological stances taken by its management and for its financial support of academic programs concerning the, quote, moral foundations of capitalism. And I should say that the question, is capitalism moral, sounds like a challenge that a critic would pose, but actually it came from the Ayn Rand side of our meetings. So without repeating your opening statement, John, do you want to talk very briefly about why morality and capitalism is a relationship that you and that the Rand folks generally emphasize?
Well, you know, when people talk about capitalism, as kind of Ezra said in a way, most people will acknowledge that capitalism, or at least a mixed economy with a free element in it, produces a higher standard of living. In fact, the evidence is so overwhelming when we have the North Koreas versus South Korea, et cetera, you almost have to come to that conclusion. But at the same time, many people perceive capitalism as either being amoral or immoral. And what's interesting is, how can an immoral system produce a better outcome? That's the academic question we pose. Obviously, we believe that capitalism is moral because it's the only system fundamentally consistent with man's nature as an independent thinking being. And we think that's non-trivial because most of the rules and regulations that are passed is under the theory that capitalism is fundamentally corrupt, but these guys are highly productive. We just got to keep balls and chains on them and keep them under control. And that's the moral justification for many rules and regulations. And we think that's that's wrong, and that it's very destructive to well-being. We think that a freer society leads to a better quality of life for everybody, on both the material level, but equally important on the spiritual level. Something I tell people, I made a lot of money, but money almost has no value in a service. This sounds funny, but it's the earning of the money that's valuable. I enjoyed earning it. I like having it, but that's secondary to earning it. And capitalism is a kind of environment where people can earn. They don't have to, even if they don't earn a lot, but they feel like what they produce is theirs. And so it's a spiritual kind of thing, not in a religious sense. Spiritual.
You want to
Sure.
talk to that?
It's funny. There's something in the way John describes capitalism, which, and Lord knows he's anything but a Marxist, but it reminds me actually of those conversations in that it is not about what even I would sort of consider the technical virtues of capitalism, but it is about a sense of a fairness, about, so the Marxist one of the Marxist arguments for why Marxism would work is that by being less alienated from your labor, by producing for the society, for the good of your fellow man, for your family, by knowing that everything is fair and it's being shared, you'll work harder. This turns out to be what's sort of bullshit. But I am going to sort of unexpectedly take a Hayekian position on this stage here and say the genius of capitalism, its true beauty and its virtue, is that it is a system of information dispersion. That the fundamental power of capitalism is the price tag. That a price tag is information. A price tag is, on the one hand, information of how much I think I need to charge to make this, and on the other, how much are you willing to pay to have it? And by using that fundamental piece of information replicated 1 million, 1 billion, 10 billion times throughout an economy, we are able to spontaneously or organically organize incredibly complex economic institutions, societies even. And similarly, I think that voting, that societies with democratic institutions have a similar function. That we organize them, and often they're complex, but the genius of voting is that it is a way for people to get together and make collective decisions that without some type of sort of organizational superstructure would be impossible to make. It would fall to warfare, to argument. It's why anarchy has also not proven terribly successful, and you can ask the Somalians if you don't believe me. And it's always been the merging of these two great systems of information and organization that have produced the wondrous gains that John speaks of. And I'll just say as one final point that I agree with everything he said about the worth of work, the moral nature of the toil. I really am very bad at taking vacation. And you can just speak to my fiance for more on that. But for a lot of people, work is not fun. It's not purposeful. The average age of retirement in this country is not 65 when Social Security benefits begin, and it isn't 70 when Social Security benefits max out. It's 62. It is as early as you can possibly retire and collect Social Security. And I think that speaks to something. That is information we need to take seriously. A lot of people work because they need to work. And that's okay. For people like John and for me who find purpose, it's a beautiful thing. And we are lucky, and I know John is driven and very, very, very smart. But I don't think we should be unsympathetic to those who haven't been as blessed in what they've done. And to understand that some of the strictures in society, some of the decisions we make collectively, are a balancing act between the beauty and power of capitalism, but also the need for society to treat those who have had a tougher time of it in a way that they feel capable of standing. That is an important stability that underlies the achievements and the rules that make it possible for those of us who are lucky in it to achieve and push things forward.
So thank you both for those answers, and I want to take the next step, I think, down that path and frame it this way. Going back to the capitalism pros and cons that were posted on It's Free Country, the two that I read, on the cons, or two of the ones I read, on the con side, we had somebody write, requires winners and losers, which if it gets out of hand is intolerably unfair for the losers, and the other one enriches some on the backs of others. So keeping in mind Ezra's question about whether the bricklayer and the choices that they have made to become a bricklayer are really the sort of moral equivalent of the banker. Is capitalism an inequality machine? These questions suggest, and many economists would argue, I think, certainly liberal economists, that the purer the capitalist system, the more rich people and the more poor people there will be. So is capitalism an inequality machine, and how much inequality is moral? John, you want to take that first?
Yes, I think that capitalism raises the standard of living for everybody. I don't think inequality per se is a standard of ethics, because it depends on what people do. And the real standard is justice. If somebody produces a lot, they should receive a lot. Now, I also think that personally that there's a role for charity to take care of people that can't produce. In my observation, and I've worked with lots of people, lots of employees over a long period of time, 95% of the people on the planet can take care of themselves. And that the number of people that can't take care of themselves is very small, and we need to help them with charity, but we certainly shouldn't organize our society to help them. In fact, capitalism has been the great machine raising all of our standard of living. And what's interesting about this distribution of wealth, the people that have made the biggest contribution in general are the ones that may have that wealth. Bill Gates, Microsoft transformed all of our lives. The Walmart family. Sam Walton family, huge. If you live in rural, small towns, Walmart's made a huge difference in quality of life, lowered the costs dramatically and improved quality. So the vast majority of people, Ezra, when we were talking on the radio, talking about the role of luck. I've worked with thousands of businesses directly, hundreds of thousands of businesses indirectly. Yeah, some people are lucky, some people are unlucky. Over time, luck, 95% of the time, gets washed out. The people that I know, and I know thousands of business people that have been successful, every single one of them earned it. They were creative, they were productive, and that's why they got what they got. And the price of putting balls and chains on those people, which is what we tend to do in this process, is to reduce the standard of living for everybody. Capitalism raises the standard of living for everybody.
Now you've got a good pragmatic question to sink your teeth into, Ezra.
There's a lot in there. I will say that I think that my colleague here takes the role of luck and of opportunity much too lightly. And let me make the point by talking about something I like to call the... Thank you, that was a trenchant point I just made. Let me make the point by talking about something, and please feel free to do that in the future, by the way, of something let me talk a bit about the inequality mobility paradox. We have very, very good data on how frequently people born in one income group move to another during the course of their lives. If you're born in the 15th% of America's sort of income distribution, how often do you move to the 30th? If you're born in the 40th% of France's income distribution, how often do you go to the 60th or the 10th? And here's what we find, and this has been replicated many, many, many times. America is, at this point, less mobile. There is less churn than Europe. But Americans believe that our society is more mobile than Europe, significantly more, that the role of human effort and energy is much more important on determining where you stand than where your parents were. Now that is demonstrably untrue, but it's important, and actually not a bad way to organize a society, because here's what I and some others think is happening here. The belief that America is a very mobile society encourages people to work very hard. Now that has been very, very good for our growth rates, but it's also meant we don't have a particularly good social safety net, which has had a variety of problems, particularly in what we've ended up with healthcare. But it has, I think, had certainly worthwhile entrepreneurial outcomes. In Europe, I think it has had a bit of a deadening effect, even as it's less true. People have been a little bit more willing to say, all right, well, let's build up some social structures and let's be more content with this. And it's funny because the reality of it just doesn't back out. It doesn't work if you look at the numbers, but it's important. And so what I would say, and I think this is one thing where we really do have a disagreement, because my God, I believe capitalism is awesome. I got an iPad up here. Have you used one of these things? The Soviets could have never made an iPad. And at this point, I've had it for about a month. I can't imagine living without an iPad. I'm not sure it's possible, actually. So I believe in capitalism, but I believe in luck. And I'll just use one quick story myself for it. I am up on the stage, not because I am a brilliant blogger, but because I began a blog between 2002 and 2003. And that was a moment of incredible opportunity. Before there were the normal structures, before blogging worked like magazines and other things where you went and apprenticed to a small organization and on and on. It was a moment of first mover advantage. And we have a lot of moments of first mover advantage. The first person to invent X, and often the first person to get to the patent office with X. And occasionally, as in the case of the telephone, the second person, because Alexander Graham Bell was actually number 2, but Elisha Gray, is that right? If anybody in the audience knows this story, Gray got there first, but wasn't able to hold the patent because he didn't have the money to do so. So Graham Bell got the money, and he got the renown, and Gray, who worked quite hard, got nothing. He became a footnote in these stories that I tell up here because I started a blog early enough that I was able to get a big readership because people were like, oh, what's a blog? And then that got me bought up by big organizations, and now I get to come to debates like this and talk to all of you. So I think that those of us who have been lucky, and I believe very strongly that as clearly smart and hardworking and decent as John is, and if you look into his background, there have been advantages and luck and near misses, because I think that's true in all of our backgrounds. And that those of us who have come out on the right side of that need not simply to be compassionate to those of us who didn't, because John is clearly compassionate. But we need to be clear about the necessity of creating a stable enough structure that for those who it doesn't work out once or twice, that they don't fall too far. Because we want them to be able to get back up on their feet and to be able to try again. And if they don't have the capacity to try again, none of this ends up working.
John, you want to continue?
Yeah, I want to respond to that. First, Ezra may have been lucky in the concrete. I'll bet you, if that opportunity hadn't been presented there, he'd have found another opportunity. I've seen too many entrepreneurs, too many people be successful, and to look at the concrete opportunity and say that was fortunate, that's true sometimes. But I find that successful people create opportunities, entrepreneurs fail, start again. I think luck is a small factor. And secondly, the upward mobility statistics he's talking about are false. The reason they're messed up is because of the massive immigration of Mexicans and South Americans and Central Americans to the United States.
Which numbers do you think I'm using, just for the record?
I've seen a bunch of these studies that claim that we don't have a
Because these correct demographically.
I don't believe they do. Well, I've seen a number of studies that I will refer you to George Mason's got a bunch of studies that you said you were talking to George Mason. There are a bunch of studies that show that the United States still has upward mobility.
No, it says it doesn't.
There are studies.
No one says it doesn't. We say that there is an Isabel Sawhill, and you're welcome to go look this up and give her a call. She's at Brookings. She lives in D.C. She answers the phone. They correct these studies. It's not like they forgot about immigration.
Yeah, but they don't correct them properly. Go look at the George Mason study. They missed the numbers, the number of immigrants, by a huge number. They missed it by $20 million, 20 million people.
Let me throw kind of a reverse capitalism morality question at you, because we always ask, how moral is it that the top 1% owns about 40% of the wealth and makes about, I believe the current stat is 22% of the income each year, when it used to be half of that in the 80s. The flip side of that is, what is the morality of the top 1% paying 40% of the taxes, if that's ballpark? The stat around this year on the other end of that is that the bottom 47% of income earners, according to one study, bottom 47% paid no income tax under the present rates last year. Is that moral? Does that have a morally corrosive effect if 47% of the people have the incentive to vote for taking other people's money to meet their needs with no payment from them?
Sure. So we have two separate questions here. One is how much money the top 1% control, and is that moral? And the second is how many federal income taxes the bottom half or so pay. And I would say two things about it. And I know this is going to sort of be a bit of a dodge, I don't think of these things terribly morally. What worries me about income inequality is that we have lost median wage growth. That a large part of the reason we're seeing this yawning gap is that we've seen very, very accelerated growth among the top and very, very slow growth among the middle. If we were seeing very quick growth among the middle and fast growth among the top, which we saw in the 90s, incidentally, I'd worry about other things before I'd worry about inequality, to be honest with you. It's not, inequality is often the sign of an unhealthy economy. The two peaks we've had in inequality in this country, literal peaks, were 1928 and 2006. And if anybody would like me to spell out why I mentioned those 2 years, I'm happy to do so. But inequality tends to come along with a imbalanced economy, which is headed very quickly for a crash. If I ran a hedge fund, I would look for very, very high inequality, and then I would sell. So that brings us up to taxes. And this data confuses the hell out of people. Federal income taxes are highly progressive. Most of our other taxes are highly regressive, namely the federal payroll tax, which pays for Social Security and Medicare and doesn't affect income above $107,000. State and local taxes tend to rely heavily on sales taxes, user fees, and other things, and tend to be very regressive. So if you look at it, the actual tax liabilities of these various groups are much more similar than they are different, particularly when you're dealing with the middle and the top. Very, very similar, and if you want to check that out, there's a good graph which you can find at Citizens for Tax Justice, which is a nonprofit tax group in Washington. So you really need to equal all that out. Now, the reason the bottom 47% or so don't pay taxes has to do with refundable tax credits. Essentially, at some point, we're doing so much of our spending through the tax code. So instead of giving somebody income support, we took an idea from Milton Friedman and we created something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. And what the Earned Income Tax Credit is, it gives you a tax rebate if you make under a separate level as income support. Now, we like putting these things in the tax code because they don't count as spending. They're a tax break. But it makes it look like nobody pays taxes. If we just had them pay taxes and rebated them the same amount of money, it would look like they paid more taxes and it would look like we're spending more money. So I think spending through the tax code tends to be a bad idea because it hides what you're spending and it creates very, very inefficient forms of spending, one of the worst parts of our healthcare system. And if you put Paul Ryan here on the imaginary third podium, he'll tell you the same thing I'm telling you, is the employer-provided tax credit, because it gives employers a reason to move compensation from wages to healthcare benefits. It makes people like me and you more distant from the true cost of our healthcare, on and on and on and on. So there are pragmatic reasons, I think, that running our spending through tax code is a problem. But for a conversation like this, the problem with it is that it makes it look like people aren't paying taxes, when what we've really done is shift around the way we do federal spending. And of course, the way people end up getting bigger and bigger, lower and lower tax liabilities tends to be these very large tax cuts from conservative politicians like Paul Ryan and George W. Bush. Like those tax cuts are hate them, that's what's behind this trend.
John, same question.
I saw a study, a news statistic, that the top 1% last year passed a mark where they paid equal in income taxes to the bottom 90%. That's a pretty interesting number.
Where did you see that?
It's a study done again by George Mason. You can look at these numbers. The top 1% pay as much as the bottom 90% in income taxes in dollars. I think the issue is twofold. I think the question is what the government doing legitimate? Is it the kind of action that should exist in a free society? And then I think the second question is what kind of economic effects are we having through our tax system? And I think the tax system creates a huge disincentive for production. I think we'd have more tax revenues with some kind of flat tax, some kind of fair tax system. I think it would actually increase productivity. And it's a shame how much time, effort, and energy businesses spend trying to manage their tax budgets so the high-income people, a lot of times making investments that are not economically efficient. So I think a fair tax, a flat tax, would actually raise our standard of living. And then the question is, how much money should the government be spent? And that I think is a very important question. I would also say this, though, and I'm probably going to get an argument on this, but this is Cato, numerous people have shown this. In 20 or 25 years, the United States economy does go broke if we don't change direction. The unfunded actuarial liability under Social Security, under Medicare, Medicaid, under the new health care program, under unfunded public pension plans is in excess of $100 trillion, $104 trillion. There was an investment banker that did a study, this is a neutral study, did it like analyzing a business, and showed the United States, if it were a business and had to report its balance sheet the way businesses do, has a $40 trillion negative net worth, and we had a $2 trillion operating deficit last year. So we have to change, or we're going to be in serious economic. Now, countries don't go broke the way businesses do. What they usually do is hyperinflate, and the standard of living falls with it. And they usually move towards more statism. In the 1930s, Argentina had a higher standard of living than the United States. They moved towards statism, and they got the consequences of that, which is a much lower standard of living, where it's about 25% of the United States. We have to have more discipline in our budgetary process, or we will be in serious financial trouble.
This is where these arguments usually start numbing people's minds on both sides.
I disagree. This is where it really gets interesting. Well, you guys don't like budget numbers?
But so we can have good amount of time for the audience. Ultimately, the arguments come down to more regulation and higher taxes and more progressive taxes create the uneven distribution and the greater amount of poverty versus the opposite. And then people have to decide which dueling statistics they believe. Give us your best 1 minute closing argument on that point with whatever dueling statistics you want, and then we're going to go to the audience.
I find the idea of dueling statistics so personally offensive. Numbers are numbers, and we need to be rigorous about them. And many of his numbers are absolutely correct. I'm not going to do a closing statement because I want to talk about what he just talked about, and I think I've made my points fairly clear. We are going broke. I mean, we are going goddamn broke, and there's no doubt about it. Now, we can get confused by talking about liabilities on an infinite horizon timescale, which is where you get numbers like 100.5 trillion. So to break it down, you're dealing with about Social Security becomes solvent over a 75-year period requires an infusion of 0.6% of GDP, so less than 1 percentage point of GDP over the next 75 years. If we eliminated the payroll tax cap, that would approximately do 0.6%, although in the 78th year, if you really want to get technical, we'd go back to having a deficit. But if we fix Social Security for 76 years, I'm okay with that. That's fine with me. Medicare and Medicaid are the big players in this game. They are entirely the result of healthcare inflation. They grow more slowly than private sector healthcare, and I want to note something here. If you fix them somehow, this would not actually be possible to do, but didn't fix private healthcare, so businesses in X number of years are paying $50,000 for private sector healthcare, and Medicare and Medicaid are paying a lot less than that. Currently, Medicare, it wouldn't work. We'd go broke on the private side. Currently, Medicare is about 20% cheaper than equivalent private insurance. This is a big problem for the Ryan plan, incidentally, which is projected to increase the cost of insurance even as it shifts who pays for it over to the senior side. That's the Congressional Budget Office. I can give you a page site if you want. It's not a dueling statistic. And the thing I'd point out, and this is where I'll go to your point here, is that these are not questions of whether or not you believe in more government or less government or socialism or not. I'll go back to the numbers I gave you at the beginning about healthcare systems in different countries. If we had Canada's healthcare system, if we paid per capita what they pay, which is about $3,400 per person, everybody insured, we pay about $7,500 per person, 50 million uninsured, we would not have a deficit problem. It would go away. It would actually be as easy as that. And I don't mean that, that's not an applause line. It's just arithmetic. So if you can figure out another way to fix it, and we can argue about different ways to fix it, fine. But the point of one way to fix it, the only way that other countries have had any real success with is, and I am not necessarily a real single-payer supporter, I prefer multi-payer systems for reasons that would make me sound quite conservative, I think, on stages that aren't this one. But nevertheless, what has worked in other countries to bring it down to a level where they can afford it is a lot more government involvement. We have managed to have a system we simultaneously can't afford that costs twice as much as everyone else's does, and we spend more on the public side while getting vastly less than anyone else does. So when it comes to setting healthcare policy, I don't want to be principled, and I don't want to be philosophical. I want to be pragmatic, I want it to work, and I want that red line to move up and up and up until it becomes a black one. And I think when you start looking at the numbers, you say, you know what? Maybe this is one of those places where we need to sort of get over talking about socialized versus laissez-faire and just do what other people have found works, just like a business will.
I have an interesting reaction to that. Are you really proposing that we set up a government system and we only spend $3,400 per person like we do in Canada? Are you willing to do that?
Well, we couldn't do it in 1 year, but am I proposing we could set up a government system and begin bringing our expenditures down from their current growth rate? I am absolutely proposing that, and not only could it be done, it has been done. In 1975, Canada and us paid the same for healthcare. And around that time, they moved over to single payer, and we didn't. And if my iPad were bigger, I'd bring up the graph, people. Our expenditures go like that, and everybody else's sort of go like this. Something went wrong for us. It went really wrong. They don't.
Yes, they do.
No, they
come
don't.
here. They do
So,
come here.
There is a study in the journal Health Affairs called Canadians in the Mist. And it looked at all these hospitals near the Canadian border to find where all these Canadians were coming from. See if you could find them anywhere, in the ERs anywhere. It's not that no Canadian has ever come here, just like plenty of Americans, just like a lot of your grandparents head over to Canada to buy their drugs. But it is just not a big thing, guys. The numbers are pretty clear on the point.
John,
It's a thing we like to think rather than a thing that's actually true.
One more response, then we're going to the audience.
The facts are a lot of Canadians do come here. I know a bunch of them. The second thing
Where's
is,
the fact?
the second thing is, and how do we care about quality deferment? It takes you much longer. I mean, there's study after study shows it takes a lot longer to get health care in Canada. In Europe, one thing they do, which is fine, is once you get a certain age, you don't get a lot of stuff that we pay for under our system. The reason private health care is more expensive than Medicare is Medicare underpays and forces the cost into private employers. And we've studied that over and over again. We're paying for a lot of Medicare people out of our private insurance program. That's a fact.
That's a true fact.
All right. Our mic bearers are going to pick the questioners. Who have we got? Over here, you got somebody?
Each one of the three speakers in this series, the three liberals, has asked the same question. Whether it's education or healthcare or whatever, the objectivists will say, well, you know, if people can't afford it, we have charities. And they always ask, but what if charity isn't enough? And maybe you can comment on this. My answer is, then you and the people who believe as you do should give more. There's no superorganism called society that democratically decides something, and then, you know, the whole superorganism moves in some direction. There's only us individuals. And when some of you vote to do something that some of us don't want to do, you point your guns at us and say your money or your life.
We really don't. I mean, whatever we do when you don't pay your payroll taxes, it is not shoot you. We very rarely shoot you for not paying payroll taxes.
We'll put you in jail.
Now, you're right. You're right that there is coercion involved. If you do not follow the laws, and we just mentioned we do need laws, it just becomes where you begin to put the line. If you do not follow the laws, there are consequences for them, and we can all pick out laws we think are unjust. But I do think this is a useful sort of instance right here with John's last answer, where you see why these things evolve in the way they do. There's an old line that, like all old lines, as far as I can tell, is attributed to Churchill. And you guys don't know this, he's the only person who said anything before 1960. Anything. He was the one in the burning bush, it turned out. There's a line attributed to Churchill where he's walking down the street, and he says to some woman who makes him angry, would you sleep with me for $1 million? And she says, well, maybe. And he says, well, how about for 100? And he says, no, what do you think I am? And he says, well, we've established what you are, we're bargaining over the price. And well, Shaw was the only other person who said it. And occasionally Keynes, who said a lot of things he didn't say. But the point being that once you begin to say, well, we need these laws to enforce these particular parts of the code that we think are great, then a couple other people sort of stand up and say, listen, I don't think you've got it covered. We need a couple more. And maybe they make some good arguments, and then you have a couple more. And then some other people get up and say, well, we got a couple more. If it was only us individuals, you're right. It'd be easier. But it ain't only us individuals. We have you see all these people in the arena here. I guess not the arena, the venue. And things get complicated real quick. And I don't want to defend corporate cronyism. I hate our tax expenditures. It is truly disgusting, a lot of what arises in government right now. I mean, mostly what I do speaking on is not sort of principles, but about broader things in the government. And I tell people that the central problem we have is not an issue problem. It isn't about healthcare policy or climate change or the budget deficit or any of the other pieces. It is about how we as a society handle problems. There is nothing more important. Because there are very few problems short of an asteroid hurtling at Earth that we can't solve. But when our mechanisms for solving problems corrode, when we begin stacking laws that don't make sense atop laws that do make sense, or when we become so paralyzed with competing interests that we can't make the decisions we need to make and our problems remain on autopilot, whether our deficit problems or our climate problems, and our solutions never get off the ground, we end up in real trouble. So it'd be nice if there were ways to do it that didn't involve all the many, many, many failures of government. And when you come across them, please let me know. Because I'm tired of getting taxed, and I'd like to be able to smoke pot, and there are all sorts of things that I'd like to do that I can't do. But for now, in another Churchillian non-saying... I'm sorry?
Equal airtime.
Yes, yes.
In another Churchillian non-saying, this is the best thing we've got, except for all the other things we've tried.
I want to follow up on this point in a fundamental way, this issue of government. I think the real threat to our society is the attack on personal responsibility. And I think when you entitle people to health care, to housing, you name it, a lot of people default to that. And the price is lack of personal responsibility, which is ultimately the end of democracies. And I think this is a huge issue. I think Rand is right that we don't need to be so worried about the 2 or 3 or 4% that can't take care of themselves. We need to worry about the 96%, and particularly that percent that's just above that poverty level, because if we take away their incentive and we take away their personal responsibility, two things happen. The quality of life falls and they give up their self-esteem. And that's really critical.
Thank you very much for coming. Please continue this outside.
That was a lot of fun. That was fun.
You have been watching a special edition of BrianLehrer.tv, a debate on the question, is capitalism moral? Pitting the Washington Post's Ezra Klein against John A. Allison, the retired chairman and CEO of the BB&T Corporation. This was the third debate in this First Principles series, sponsored by the Ayn Rand Institute, Demos, and WNYC's itsafreecountry.org. You can find this and all of our programs archived on the web at BrianLehrer.tv. And I invite you to listen to my daily radio show on WNYC AM 820 and FM 93.9, 10 a.m. on the weekdays. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.